Hello, my name is Mark, and thank you for tuning into The Real Radical Progressive. In this video, I want to explain the events that led me to start this channel. When I look out at the political divide today, I feel as though both the left and the right have lost their minds. I'm not as worried about what's happened to the right, not that there isn't plenty to be concerned about, but probably because I've always identified with the political left, I'm much more concerned with the growing intolerance I see on the left. In their march to embrace diversity, which is a laudable goal, the ideological left has forgotten about both tolerance and unity. Oddly, for all the talk of diversity, any diversity of opinion is not tolerated. They, and by they I mean the most vocal of the radical left, quickly brand anyone that isn't ideologically in lockstep with them as racists, bigots, or misogynists. One of the reasons that Martin Luther King's movement was so successful was that he carefully crafted his message to be inclusive of everyone. Of course, he was talking about the liberation of the black man, but he talked about it in terms of all men being equal. In his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, he said, "I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit together at the table of brotherhood." Unless you're an honest-to-God racist bigot, it's hard to find any fault in such a statement. Yes, of course, as a person, I need to make sure that there's room at the table for everyone. If there are racist laws or institutions, I need to be right there in solidarity with my fellow citizens, making sure that equality is the law of the land. It seems, however, as I said before, that the left has completely abandoned the tenets of tolerance and unity, not to mention civility. It seems like every time I turn on the news, there's yet another story about left-leaning activists screaming and or rioting. Oddly, many of them don't even believe in freedom of speech, the most fundamental of all liberal values. Activists like these, along with several others, left me wondering, where did this intolerance come from? Many people point at gender and ethnic studies programs that sprouted up in universities all across the nation in the 80s and 90s. And while there is some truth to that, I think it's worth pointing out that this sort of intolerance on the left, where we use ad hominem attacks rather than honestly debate, goes back quite a bit further. This is William F. Buckley Jr. and Gore Vidal in a rather famous debate that many claim ushered in the era of the talking head political television show. What I find interesting is that while politically I'm much more aligned with Gore Vidal, I'm much more sympathetic, at least in this debate, to William F. Buckley. Buckley came to this debate to truly debate. Vidal's strategy was to continuously bait and antagonize Buckley until Buckley finally lost his temper on national television. In other words, Vidal's strategy wasn't to have a healthy debate. Rather, his goal was simply character assassination. So, as I thought about a channel, it would have naturally been in response to the so-called SJW, or Social Justice Warrior movement, but then I realized two things. One is that there's already a plethora of YouTube channels with giant audiences, such as Thunderfoot, Sargon of Akkad, and Armored Skeptic, just to name a few, doing exactly that. But more importantly, all I would actually be accomplishing is adding more fuel to an already raging fire. I would just be adding to the noise when what we really need, I think, is more dialogue. And I actually admire that these social justice activists are taking a stand and trying to make the world a better place. Don't get me wrong, I disagree with their methods, and I quite frankly think their ideology is dead wrong, but I do admire that they are passionate in trying to make the world a better place as they see it. I then started thinking about the times in my life that my views have been fundamentally changed. I grew up in a very rural, conservative part of the state, and I'm embarrassed to admit that as a young man, I was a bit of a homophobe. So what changed my views? I must say it wasn't activist screaming, and it certainly wasn't the gay pride movement. What changed my views was working with and becoming friends with gay people. Very quickly, I realized just exactly how wrong-headed I was. Which brings me to Daryl Davis, one of my personal heroes. He's a professional musician. He's played behind some of the greats, such as Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis, but that's not why he's a hero of mine. What makes him a hero, at least in my book, is his hobby. Mr. Davis collects KKK robes from Klan members whose minds he's changed. He has several at this point. He acquires them by befriending members of the Klan and showing them their racist beliefs are ridiculous. He's been so effective that, in large part due to his actions, the Klan as an organization fell apart in the state of Maryland. I think in terms of changing hearts and minds, we could all learn something from Mr. Davis. In the midst of all this, I found the Rubin Report on YouTube, and I must admit I'm a huge fan. Dave Rubin, for those of you who don't know, was part of the Young Turks Network, which was about as left-leaning as you can find. He's also, as he puts it, gay married. My point is that he came into this as bleeding heart liberal as you could be. Then he had what he calls his waking up moment, where he started seeing the same problems that I see on the left. It happened for him when Ben Affleck called Sam Harris gross and racist on the Bill Maher show, when all Sam Harris had done was recite some data from Pew polls regarding attitudes of Muslims. Dave Rubin then went on to talk and interview people predominantly from the conservative side of the aisle, a move that I applaud. Unfortunately, what I see happening to Dave Rubin, and as well as many other people, is that they're shifting away from progressive ideals towards more libertarian views. I think this is happening for a couple of reasons. The first, most obvious, is that since everyone on the left has gone completely insane, the only rational voices left at the grown-up table are more libertarian. The other truth that cannot be denied is that, at least at first blush, libertarianism, also known as classic or Jeffersonian liberalism, is a very seductive ideology. I should know I was at one point in my life a card-carrying member of the Libertarian Party. First, since the word liberal has been used and misused so often in our political history, I think it's important to identify what exactly classic liberalism is. This is John Locke, arguably the most important figure in codifying what classic liberalism is. And of course, the gentleman on the bottom is Thomas Jefferson, who was such a proponent of liberalism that many libertarians refer to themselves as Jeffersonian liberals. There are volumes of books on the subject of classic liberalism, but the tenets are actually pretty straightforward. The first is individual liberty, which covers things like freedom of speech, the right to peaceably assemble, freedom of and from religion, the right to own property, etc., etc. Essentially, the fundamental rights as laid out by the U.S. Constitution. The second is limited government, especially federal government. Thomas Jefferson felt that the federal government should only have power over things that were truly national or international in nature. The third and final tenet involves free, and by free they mean unregulated, markets. The government should by and large leave markets to themselves, and this will, of course, lead to maximizing prosperity, I guess. This all looks so good on paper. But then, so does communism. I will be going more in depth on why we need strong central government and strong regulation in future episodes. But here are a few of the reasons why I gave up on classic liberalism. The first reason is called the tragedy of the commons. It's essentially a prisoner's dilemma situation. In the textbook example, we're all ranchers and there's public grazing land that we can all use for our livestock. Obviously, it's in all of our collective best interest to not overgraze this resource or we won't have the use of it in the future. However, it's in each of our best individual interest to make sure that we personally are maximizing our use of this free resource. So, if there's no regulating body, meaning no government, to dictate a hopefully equitable use of the commons, then the commons get destroyed and we're all the worse off for it. However, even with that in mind, I might still think there was a way to make the libertarian view work if we had the same population now as we did in the time of Jefferson. When Jefferson was president, there were approximately 5 million Americans. Now there are over 320 million of us. I can't stress enough just how much of a game-changer population is. Just as an example, think of building codes. Realistically, if your nearest neighbor is a mile or two down the road, out of what and how your neighbor decides to build their house doesn't really concern you. But if your nearest neighbor's house is 10 feet from you, him deciding to, say, construct his house out of gasoline sauté bells, that's probably going to have a very tangible impact on you. In other words, as the population increases, so necessarily does the need for regulation and oversight. My final point on this is the very existence of a middle class. America's had 2 periods in its history with a strong middle class. The first started in the Jeffersonian era and lasted about 50 years. It was caused, by and large, by the Western expansion. A person could simply move west and claim land. The next time we had a middle class wasn't until the post-Roosevelt era, just after World War II, peaking in the late 60s and early 70s, and, sad to say, it's been steadily declining since the Reagan era. The libertarian position is that lower taxes will lead to more prosperity for everybody, and yet even though taxes are way lower now than they were pre-Reagan, we've watched the steady decline of the American middle class ever since. So it would seem that despite all conservative predictions, we can't just cut our way to prosperity. So that's the show. If you liked it, please hit the like button. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. If you think I'm wrong about something, or heck, if you think I'm right about something, please comment. I appreciate hearing from you, and I think that the only way forward is with sincere, rational dialogue. So let's do it. This is Mark. I am the Real Radical Progressive, and until next time, take care and be well.